Welcome to the last day of TF Nation 2017. Are we all having a good time?
Yeah.
Are we all feeling a bit tired?
Yeah.
Yeah? Well, I think you'll all agree that periodically throughout these conventions we get to do things which we've not been able to do before, which are really, really exciting, and this is one of them. Is literally for the first time on stage here at a UK Transformers convention, we've got Mr. Simon Furman and Mr. Bob Budiansky! Two men who've known each other for quite a few years.
Quite a few.
Yes. And we thought it would be a really good idea for them to start having a bit of an exchange and sort of give you a little bit of insight into the history that they've shared together throughout the franchise. And then obviously if you have any questions directed at both of them, we've just got people photographing this moment here at the back. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, I suppose the first question to get us started, just in case anybody wasn't here yesterday for your individual panels, just to give a brief introduction as to how you started on the franchise, and then maybe Bob, take it from there and talk about how you chose and handpicked Simon.
Okay, well, I guess in chronological order, I was the first one of the two of us to be involved with the Transformers. So, forgive me for repeating myself from yesterday for those of you who were at my panel yesterday, but basically in 1983, Hasbro Toys came to Marvel, asked Marvel to develop this new product that they had called Transformers into a storyline of sorts so that they could exploit it in different mediums other than just as a toy, so they could make comic books and animation and so on. And Marvel, as they had done with Hasbro Toys' G.I. Joe franchise a couple of years earlier, they developed a treatment or a backstory or a Bible, basically the basic storyline, which was developed by the Marvel editor-in-chief at that time. That was Jim Shooter. And eventually Jim came to me. I was one of the staff editors, asked me to further develop it as far as all the characters went. So over a long weekend in November of '83, I basically developed the initial 26 characters, came up with most of their names and all their personality profiles. Jim and Hasbro both liked what I did, and then I remained associated with the Transformers property, both in terms of developing more and more characters as more and more toys were created by Hasbro, and also writing the book editing the 4-issue miniseries that began the comic book, and then following the 4-issue miniseries, writing most of the next 51 issues that followed. So that was between November '83 and sometime in 1989. That was my tenure on the Transformers. And throughout that period, as I mentioned a moment ago, Hasbro, because of the great success of the Transformers, would continue to introduce dozens and dozens of new toys, and they would come to me to develop them. So over that period of time, I estimate I named about 252 of the Transformers, wrote their personality profiles, all that packaging that you saw if you bought the toy, those personality profiles on the back, those are things that I wrote. And then came Simon.
Yeah, over in good old UK, in the offices of Marvel UK, which was, completely part of Marvel Comics, but this strange little outpost in London that mostly did reprint titles. But largely they did also a bit of origination as well, and often these package deals came where if Marvel America had a title like Transformers, Marvel UK had first dibs on that comic in the UK, and right away I think Marvel UK thought that's worth us having. And even before, I think they had the material for the first 4-issue miniseries, Marvel UK started originating their own UK strip. I think they thought, if it's only going to be 4 issues, we'll create some more material and keep it going for a while longer. So I was just a freelance writer, brought in by one of the editors to meet the editor of Transformers UK. There was one story already in progress, which was Man of Iron, which was written by Steve Parkhouse and drawn by John Ridgway. and I was just handed a sheaf of paper, which were Bob's character profiles. We had some of the toys. We had probably the Jim Shooter story outline, maybe. You know, we had enough that it was like, well, look, here you go. Here's all of it. Go away and come up with nice self-contained stories that aren't going to mess up what's happening in the American comic. So that's why those early stories, my first one was called The Enemy Within, often just took 2 or 3 characters, sometimes the lesser known ones. My first one was Brawn and Ravage, really, are the main players in it, and Starscream for a bit of a kind of higher up character. But they had to be really self-contained, done in one, and not mess with whatever was happening over in the, at the time, 4-issue limited series. So, you know, and that's the way the UK strip rolled on from there. We were always, you know, the American story continued, so we would start to just drop batches of origination in between the available American strip material, which came to us just as printer-ready film, which we actually had to then scrape the back off to turn the American spellings into English spellings. So yeah, you know, that's the way we rolled pretty much from there. And we started doing our own thing a bit more, and we got more confidence with it. But all the time, we were very much aware that we were waiting on the next batch of plot or script from the Marvel US office.
And unlike Simon and the Marvel UK office, where they had to pay attention to every little thing that we did in the United States as far as the Transformers go, like, you know, what the next story was going to be about, which characters were featured, etc. We paid absolutely no attention to anything going on here. We didn't even know that England existed.
Now, I've got to confess, Bob was not our favourite guy at the time in the UK offices. We thought he was just this kind of mighty Marvel writer who didn't care about us. We were right, actually, but...
The New York City offices thought of me the exact same way.
But of course, you know, if Bob was even slightly behind on his schedule, you know, we were continually on the phone back in the day to the Marvel US office to say, have you got the next plot outline? We need to know where Bob's story picks up so that we can, you know, leave our characters in the right place for that. If Bob's going to bring in special teams, we can't do that in our story. We've got to wait for Bob to do it. And, you know, as the UK comic evolved, we had a few times where it simply didn't work for us. By the time we would have got to where special teams came in the US story, it would have been too late for Hasbro UK, who wanted to market those toys and the comic in the same, you know, sort of time period. So we had to come up with a whole UK story that was effectively a dream of Buster Witwicky's, where because he's had the Matrix in his head, he sees into the future and sees the future, the advent of special teams. So ahead of special teams appearing, we had this one-off UK story, just to keep Hasbro UK happy and get our, you know, advertising, because we used to tag onto their TV advertising. So it was really worth our while, you know, featuring the characters they wanted to feature at a certain time slot. But it did create problems for us. Well,
this is all very interesting to me. I really didn't know what was going on this side of the pond. So, but it sounds like Simon and his team, you know, were very creative in trying to fit in between the storylines that we were coming out with in the US. At some point, I had pretty much run out of gas on Transformers, so we were able to take these 2 parallel threads of me working in the US and Simon working in the UK, and we brought them together over lunch in London in February '89. And
actually, there was a meeting before.
Oh, there was, I guess, yeah.
You know, we're jumping ahead one step because, like I say, up to this point, none of us had met Bob. You know, he was just a name on a script, and we were probably dealing with whoever the editor was in the kind of 20s and 30s. So, you know, we didn't really know Bob at all. And in 1987, I think it was, in lieu of a pay rise, you know, this is how cheap Marvel UK were, they just gave me a jolly to New York. They said, look, we can more or less as a business trip, you go to Marvel US, meet the editors there, especially the Transformers people. And, you know, I was just like, great, gimme. Fine, I don't want a pay rise. I just want to go to New York and the Marvel offices. So I got to go over and meet, maybe it was Don Daly by that point. So Don Daly was the editor. I finally got to meet Bob, and instead of this sort of standoffish, slightly gruff guy we imagined, there's this really friendly, amiable sort of, oh yeah, Simon, whatever you want. I didn't know, and so suddenly from there, we just had a relationship, and I think it went much smoother from there, just because, that personal contact thing just makes all the difference.
Well, like I said earlier, I mean, as the writer of the Transformers on the American side, I really wasn't, well, maybe I was barely aware of the existence of the Marvel UK editions and Simon and his work. So, yeah, having finally given the chance to meet him, like Simon said, he found out I'm an okay guy, and we got along fine. I don't know if that changed my my tendency to turn in my plots at the last minute and make it any easier for you for the next couple of years, but at least we got to know each other.
And sort of by that time, we were doing bigger and bigger batches of UK originated strip and buying ourselves more and more time for the next wave of American material. So by the time we got to 89, it was, I think we were quite separate in a strange way. We were just doing more UK material, and then we do a longer run of US material to catch up. So it wasn't quite so stressful by then. I think we just got, Transformers UK was selling gangbusters. We were at our peak. We were something like 200,000 copies a week. And in a UK news trade market. So it was incredible, and we became much more self-supportive and able to do more and more origination. And we had one visit from Jim Shooter, who came over and looked at what we were doing on Transformers and gave us, the Shooter version of Marvel Comics. But we loved all that.
I guess I was lucky in the sense that because Transformers really didn't exist in the Marvel Universe, although it slightly did, but not really. Jim Shooter paid almost no attention to what we did in Transformers over in the US side of things. Once he wrote the original treatment of it, handed it over to me, he was happy to move on to other things. So I didn't have him looking over my back on much of anything.
So what, 1989?
So in 1989, okay. Building up to my visit here in 1989, so for probably almost a year, I was going to my editor, Don Daly, who Simon mentioned a few minutes ago, and pretty much begging him to find another writer for the book, because I had been working on it now for like 4 or 5 years, and I felt I was kind of tapped out, and I wanted to move on to other things. I was still a full-time editor at Marvel. I was writing a monthly book in addition to being a full-time editor, and had some ideas of other things I wanted to do with my free creative time, my non-office, non-editorial time. So I was looking to move on to something else. And I would repeatedly go to my editor and say, hey, do you have anybody else you think could write this book? And he would always say, no, I don't know anyone else who could write this book. You got to stay on the book. You can't leave. I'll slash my wrists if you do. Don't go anywhere. So I stayed on the book. And then finally in 1989, in February 89, I actually took a vacation here to England. And among my many stops was London. And Simon and I got together. And we had a really nice lunch. Do you remember where it was?
It was in Covent Garden.
Covent Garden, okay. We had burgers and beer.
Probably Marvel UK actually sort of splashed out on a bit of petty cash for that meal,
So. Oh, thank you, Marvel UK. I didn't realize that. Anyway, so we sat down to lunch, and I basically said to Simon, I'm kind of tapped out on doing any more Transformers stories. Perhaps you want to take over writing the American book. Now, little side note, as the writer of the book, I have no authority to hand over a book that I'm writing to another writer. Really, that's the editor's job. But I kind of presumed a little bit more power in these situations than I actually might have had. Take over from there.
Yeah, and it was great for me. When Bob said would like to take over, I almost kind of tore the Marvel voucher out of his hand, because it was a big deal for me, this. It wasn't just more Transformers. It was kind of my door opener at Marvel US, which was always my end goal, really, to sort of to graduate, I guess, to...
His door opener was my escape hatch.
But to me it was brilliant. But Bob, in his way, sort of said, "So Simon, do you want to take over?" And I'm like, yes, and he says, "It's a dying book. You've got maybe 4 or 5 issues and it's gone. Sales aren't great." And I'm still like, no, gimme. So, but you didn't oversell it, I'll give you that.
I didn't want to build up your hopes too much, but here you are today, so I guess it worked out.
And it worked out, and we got something like 25 issues out of it, all the way up to issue 80 from there. And and it was great. And my first story I did was drawn by Jose Delbo, who was the regular artist on the book, and it was very much, I hoped, a kind of continuation of Bob's story. It felt very much using all the characters he had around in his storyline, Scorponok, the Micromasters, all these characters. I tried to pull that thread along, so it didn't look like, bang, I'm here and I'm going to change everything in the first issue. But kind of after that first 4 issues, I'm just like, right, now I'm going to change everything. So, all the threads I've introduced into the UK comic, Unicron, the move, that kind of idea of this, god of Transformers, it all got literally dropped into the next 2 issues of Transformers. We managed to import Jeff Senior in to do some of the artwork, so it even started to look a little like the UK comic. So and Don was wonderful, because Don was just like, whatever you want to do. You're driving this, Simon, now, so Don was brilliant. He was so hands-off with it, and that was great. So, again, I think even Hasbro by that point probably weren't looking at the book as closely as they had been in Bob's time, because the toy line was kind of coming to a close at that point by 1989, 1990. So Hasbro, I think their mind was somewhere else on other things. And, I think they just let us then do things. And also there were wave of new characters coming in. So we were allowed to more or less just bring back a lot of the classic guys and tell these big epic, space opera stories. And we took the action off Earth for a lot of it, just for a change of pace. And just generally, it was, I just thought, this is my chance to impress. So I'm not going to just do what Bob's been doing. I'll try something different and see what we can do. But, I have no idea whether you continue reading the book at this point, Bob.
No.
See, this is it.
Don't take it personally.
So, what did you go on to, Bob, after this?
Well, I developed a new character called Sleepwalker, which became a comic book in Marvel. It published for about almost 3 years, and had a lot of fun doing it. So I was happy to, create the time in my schedule so I can pursue that. And we went through the Marvel system of approvals. I submitted it. We had what was called a new project committee. The new project committee reviewed it. They kicked it upstairs to the editor-in-chief, and after tweaking it a little bit, it became a regular monthly comic book. So that's what leaving Transformers did for me. It gave me the opportunity to pursue something else creatively.
And for me, it led to more work at Marvel America. I got to write Alpha Flight for about 2 years or so. I did a whole bunch of What Ifs, She-Hulk, and so to me, it was exactly the door opener that I'd wanted.
And don't forget, you wrote Brute Force for me.
There we go, you see. And Brute Force was an interesting one, because Brute Force was kind of Marvel's first effort, wasn't it, to do it the other way round, to create a comic book that would become a toy line. And Bob, you did all the grounding work on that.
I was the editor on it. I don't know how much else I did on it. I forget.
I thought you did all the character stuff.
I might have.
With Transformers.
Yeah, I might have did off some of the characters. But it was a 4-issue miniseries that was actually a 4-issue miniseries.
Yes.
It didn't go on.
No, we didn't get to do 80 in a 4-issue miniseries with that one. So, but these things never go away. They turned up in a Deadpool manual of all things not long ago. Yes. I mean, they kind of took the mickey out of them, but. I suppose that kind of brings us up to date, except that I suppose neither of us, once we go into the 90s much, thought we would be here best part of 30 years later, still talking about this work to a room full of fans who never let it go, and I think that's great to us, because certainly for me, Transformers has generally supported my whole career. When Dreamwave picked up the license, I got more Transformers work, IDW, and just generally, after a while of that kind of, I don't want to be known as the guy who does Transformers, I'm like, give it up.
Similarly, I feel very flattered that I was able to work on something and contribute to the creation of something that has this kind of longevity and this kind of loyalty among its fans. So I'm very happy to be here at the present moment, and I'm very happy that I've had this continuing association with the Transformers, which kind of like Simon said, I thought, when I left it in '89, that was it. It was a dying book. It didn't take a couple of years to die, but it took its natural course, and I would move on, and that would be behind me. But here I am today, so I'm very happy that it's had this resonance over the years.
Yeah, and kind of on a personal level, Bob became a really good friend over the intervening years. Every time I would go back to New York, I would kind of try and gather the clan of my Marvel, if you like, of that sort of late 80s, early 90s. So I would say to everyone, whether they were still at Marvel or not, let's just get together for a few beers somewhere, and that still endures to the day. We just recently we got together. Yeah,
just in New York a few months ago, and I came out here a couple of years ago and spent some time with Simon, and so our relationship goes beyond just the Transformers.
Right, okay, wonderful. Have we got any questions in the audience? We've got some hands. Yeah, we've got some hands over here.
Hello again. So, do you think, because what Bob was saying yesterday about the fact that you obviously worked as Hasbro's toy release for the first set of issues, which obviously was a big pressure to just get the stories and write the stories about each of those, do you think that then, once Simon took over, that the comic really benefited, the storyline of the comic benefited because of the pressures that maybe Hasbro were putting on, and did it give you more creative freedom, I guess, is my question?
Well, in retrospect, I always felt a bit sorry for Bob, because he did have this, every other issue, an influx of 10 to 15 to 20 characters. And in story terms, as a writer, it is very limiting. It limits you because you may have favourite characters that you just have to sideline for a while, or maybe forever. And, or it just is like, in larger story terms, having to keep force-feeding characters into a already crowded storyline is tough. And in a way, we had it easy in the UK, because all our stories were sort of side stories. They very rarely introduced characters, so we had it much easier than Bob. And in kind of retrospect, I just think you had the far more difficult job with this.
Okay, well, yeah, can't argue that. Basically, every few months I had to figure out a new way to introduce a bunch of new characters into this storyline. And hopefully I was able to do it seamlessly enough that you as the reader just thought, oh great, here's a new bunch of characters. They showed up in this new way that hasn't been shown before, like a Bridge to Nowhere, or I forget some of the other ways I created ways for bringing new characters in. But so hopefully, as I met these challenges of bringing in these new characters, I did them in creative and entertaining ways, so the readers just felt like this was a welcome new addition to the continuing story.
And by the time I was writing the American comic, like I say, Hasbro's, there weren't new waves of toys coming, so it really was, I could just indulge myself with the characters that I wanted to tell stories about, kill a few off, which has always been fun to do, and yeah, I guess I just had, everybody assumed, like Bob did, that our days were numbered, which they were, but in that time I just thought, well, let's go out with a bang rather than a whimper, and so yeah, we just threw everything but the kitchen sink into those 20, 25 issues.
I really love the incorporation of Spider-Man into the stories. Not closer, how's that? I really love the Spider-Man story that you did. I know you had problems because they didn't like Spider-Man in it so much, but I was wondering, who else from the Marvel roster do you both of you think would have made a good match or interesting stories in the Transformers?
Well, so you mentioned the Spider-Man story. Before I answer your question exactly, so you have to understand the reasoning behind bringing Spider-Man in. At the time, Transformers was a fairly unknown property. Marvel didn't know what it had, whether it was going to be successful at all. So the guy who was writing the Transformers ad issue, Jim Salica, coincidentally was a Spider-Man editor. So he thought, well, here's a way to boost sales. Let's bring Spider-Man in. The initial reaction from Hasbro Toys was to reject that idea because now we look at it as we're giving you the #1 flagship character of our company, and we're allowing him to be featured in your unknown property, this comic book called Transformers. And you're rejecting it, and the reason they rejected it was because at that time, a different toy company had the license to the Spider-Man action figures. So Hasbro, a toy company, looked at it as we were helping to promote their rival toy company. They weren't looking at it as we were helping to boost the sales of the Transformers comic book by featuring our #1 character. So that was kind of an interesting point of view that we hadn't considered. So, and they had the final call on it. So we came up with a creative solution. Jim Salicrup said, well, Spider-Man recently got this new costume, this black costume, black and white costume. Why don't we show him in the black and white costume, since the black and white costume is not a licensed action figure by the rival toy company. So that's why that particular issue features Spider-Man in the black and white costume. So we can get around that problem and everybody was happy. As far as other characters that might have benefited, or the Transformers comic might have benefited from, I didn't really give it much thought, to be honest, because I knew that basically the way Marvel worked, there's the Marvel Universe characters over here, and there's the licensed characters over there, and most of the time they did not intersect. I'm sure, there are a lot of, I guess Iron Man would be a good character. He's a human who's full of technology as opposed to robots who are full of technology. I guess that would have been a good matchup in some ways. But I never really, as a writer, I rarely gave it any thought about who I'd like to guest star because it wasn't even an option.
But didn't you do something with Circuit Breaker where you created a Marvel character in Transformers?
Yeah, so Circuit Breaker is a sort of antagonist/protagonist that I created. And we featured her first in a Marvel comic book, I think in one of the Secret Wars issues. And the only reason to do that was to keep the copyright from Marvel. Because I thought the character had potential beyond Transformers, and any character that was created and first appeared in a Transformers comic book automatically became a Hasbro copyrighted character. And I didn't feel that Hasbro deserved to have a non-Transformers human character automatically be one of their characters. So made it a Marvel character.
This was useful to us when it came to Death's Head, because we had the same situation. We immediately knew if we dropped Death's Head in Transformers, we couldn't really use him as any kind of Marvel character subsequently. So we took the model that Bob had done, and we created that Marvel one-page strip featuring Death's Head, so that again, we retained the copyright.
You touched briefly, Simon, about being able to indulge yourself and kill characters off. Did either of you find that Hasbro would kick off, so to speak, about characters being killed and that you were killing off a property?
Yeah, I mean, I think we both killed a lot between us. But you used to clean shot fairly regularly.
Yeah, I mean, bringing up the idea of killing off characters. So, as we both said, we would have to bring in probably me more than Simon during my run. Dozens of new characters that were introduced as toys. We have to find ways to get them into the storyline. So sometimes you just had to clear house and make some room for them, and I'd find, hopefully dramatic ways where there'd be some big battle and some characters would be temporarily taken off the stage, whether they were killed or disabled or whatever. I always looked at writing Transformers as a robotic life form never really completely died. They could always be rebuilt. When I was growing up, one of the comic books I read regularly was Metal Men, DC comic book, and those guys got destroyed like every issue. And by the following issue, they had been repaired and rebuilt, and they were back in working order. So I just kind of took my cue from that, like, well, I can destroy these guys now. If I want to bring them back in 10 issues, I can figure out a way to repair them and bring them back.
You know, I think as I mentioned in my panel yesterday, when Bob killed off Optimus Prime and Megatron, we found that was a problem for us. You know, I think in the UK, they were still such iconic characters and fan favourites that we didn't want the next however many issues without Optimus Prime and Megatron. So we did have to do, and I'm not going to go through the whole loop again, but we did have to do that whole thing where we really took a step outside and risked clashes of continuity by bringing Megatron straight back into the UK story as if he'd only, you know, sort of disappeared for an issue or two. And, you know, it did cause us problems down the line, but we thought it was a risk worth taking just because we thought our audience won't weather no Megatron, and, you know, we did have to go with less Optimus Prime, but we found we could try ways to keep him kind of a presence in the story.
Also, more to your question about what Hasbro thought, I think generally they were okay with me disposing of certain characters because if they weren't promoting the character as a toy, they didn't care. So if I moved out Optimus Prime, let's say, or whoever, and I brought in the Dinobots because that's their new toy line, that's what they wanted. They wanted to see the Dinobots. They didn't care about the characters that were toys last year. You know, they cared about the characters that were the new toys. So to the reader, it may not have appeared that way, but to me it was like, okay, well, this is what Hasbro wants to promote. I'll put these guys in, and it doesn't matter about the other characters that we've been featuring for the previous year.
How did the US audience react to you moving over to Transformers US, like to your comics, you know, like Matrix West and all that? What was the reaction? Was it good or was it bad? Or
Do you mean when I took over on
when you
the
took over
US
the
book?
US?
Well, you know, it's funny because we think of reaction now as internet reaction and it's immediate, but all we had in the day was a mailbag. And, you know, and that there was always a time delay in that to actually, you know, getting the letters processed and in print, probably, you know, 4 or 5 or 6 issues down the line. And I don't think really the readers were too, you know, certainly the readers who've been following the comic for a long time cared very much that we'd switched writers. I don't think either they were either like, oh, brilliant that you're on board, Simon, or, you know, sad that Bob's not. I just think, you know, all they cared about was the Transformers story itself. And as long as things continued fairly seamlessly, I don't remember negative or positive reaction. It was just, you know, that was a good story, that wasn't. You know, why did you do that, why didn't you do that? It was more that kind of thing. I don't remember any sort of kind of negative or positive feedback. But these days, of course, it will be instantaneous. In fact, it would have been known months before, and we'd have already had, you know, probably the internet backlash of like, don't let Furman on that book, for God's sakes, he's going to kill it.
I discovered when I first started looking at the internet and looking up my name and seeing all of these, seeing my name mentioned in all of these Transformers online columns from like the late 90s, which I didn't know existed until then, that I got far more negative feedback in the 15 years after I stopped writing the book than I ever did when I was actually writing the book.
Guys have talked a bit about specifics about the process of writing, what you were doing at the time, but I just wanted to ask you, the business of producing like icons, biographies, thread lines, plot lines, how do you replenish your creative energy? Where do you get your inspiration from outside of the work?
I replenish my creative energy by quitting and letting Simon take over.
I refresh my creative energy by sort of generally, after a good enough while, kind of recycling stories in a slightly different way. You know, that old MGM quote about give me the same but different, I adhere to quite sort of rigidly, really, and I think it generally works.
You're asking a question which is true for any kind of medium that involves writing something, creating a story. I just look for inspiration from a whole number of sources, whether it's the television news or a movie I saw or a book I read or a newspaper article or something a friend of mine says to me offhandedly and inspires something. And you just hope that you can spin a story out of some of these things that you're exposed to.
You know, specifically with Transformers, when I first came on the UK comic, it was great because everything was there, all the sort of character stuff, which is where most story for me springs from, was just there. So all I had to do was kind of go, well, that's a good character, that's interesting, and who's the sort of perfect foil for that character? And then the story builds itself around them. So, you know, Bob's work he'd done on the character bios kind of made it easy for me in the first instance, and that followed through all the way with Transformers for me, because the characters were so rich that really you didn't have to go far to get a decent story just by throwing those characters together and seeing how they bounce off each other.
Also, I approached writing the Transformers as the ultimate fish out of water story. So you have these giant alien robotic life forms of immense power, and you put them on Earth. So to me, what made writing the Transformers interesting was to find situations where these alien life forms intersected and conflicted with us Earthlings. So I would just find like everyday situations that, you know, hopefully were more interesting than other situations, and put them in there and see what would happen. So and things that I experienced myself. So I had them at a rock concert. I went skiing, I had him on a ski slope. I went to a Caribbean island, I put him on a Caribbean island. I went to the Grand Canyon, I put him in the Grand Canyon. So I found all of these situations in my own life, and again, thought like, okay, here's an interesting place that exists in my world, something that I myself have experienced. What would happen if I dropped a few Autobots and Decepticons in the middle of it? And that was a springboard for a lot of the stories that I came up with.
And I would say that the human perspective is really important. And when we started the IDW verse, we did it from the same thing, except slightly more so. We started with the human element. And so immediately, as soon as the robots appear, you get this quite mythic quality to them. You know, and we asked EJ, the artist, to often take the angle of a human looking up at these giant robots. So you've got this sort of, this kind of awesome, inspiring angle of these things towering over you. You know, because if you just draw the robots at eye level to the reader, they're just characters on the page. But we really wanted that human perspective on the story and on the robots, because they just become more immense and powerful the more you see them through human eyes.
Sorry, hi, that's loud. You mentioned during your panel, you mentioned during your panel about Marvel liking their own characters over here and licensed characters over there. But we did get crossover between G.I. Joe, Action Force and Transformers. Were there any other properties that were talked about, or at least for potential crossover, any other licensed properties from Hasbro? Because today IDW are doing all that crossover now, but back then, was it even a subject?
Back then, the only subject really was G.I. Joe, because that was a natural, they're both Hasbro properties. As far as other crossover potential, I don't remember anything coming up in conversation, and if it did come up, I guess it was shot down really quickly, but nothing really came out of it.
I mean, it never happened, but briefly, IDW were talking about a Transformers Terminator crossover, because Dynamite had the Terminator license at the time, or certainly the T2 license. It's kind of difficult, but we actually got as far as coming up with a storyline enmeshed in the sort of the IDW verse that featured Terminators, but in the end it became too much of a logistical headache with all the licensing and the legal side of it to actually, get to print it.
You've both been both editors and writers in your career. And do you find that having that experience on both sides of the fence is useful to you?
Being useful as an editor and a writer?
Is having the experience of being both an editor and a writer, is it kind of useful in seeing both sides of of that and and knowing?
Well, for me, being an editor, I didn't come up as a writer at Marvel, but I became an editor, and just being around other writers and understanding the comic book art form of writing, what was involved, made me a better writer. So without a doubt, it was a big help. It was one thing to be a reader, which I grew up reading comic books, so I'm sure that infused a lot of my writing style or whatever, but being an editor and understanding the structure that goes into a story and how to make it exciting and appealing to a reader, I think that definitely helped my writing.
I mean, for me, I think knowing the practicalities of getting a weekly or a monthly comic book out really helps you as a writer yourself, because you understand, you really are the beginning of the food chain, and if you're late, everything starts getting later through the process, and it helps to understand. But conversely, I found it helps that being an editor, being a writer myself, I understand how freelancers can be, and you just don't take any crap after a while, because you understand that if they're saying there's this problem, there probably isn't. It's just like, they're doing something else at the same time, so I think it really helps, and generally it eases communication both ways.
Hiya. Question for both of you. What was the most annoying or sort of silliest thing you had to work into the story, on Hasbro's demands? What do you think was the silliest toys you had to introduce? And how am I going to do that?
I always thought headmasters were the silliest ones. Actually, I think you can do good things with them, and Bob certainly did, and I tried to as well. But the whole gimmick of these guys, they lift their heads off. I thought it was just such a strange concept. Fundamentally, what you can do with it is great, but of all the gimmicks, I think that was the one where I kind of scratched my head a bit and thought, well, literally, what are they thinking with this?
Well, other than Hasbro making like a general mandate that we're going to roll out these, no pun intended, we're going to roll out these new toys and they need to get introduced into the storyline somehow, they never came to me and said specifically, you have to show, Bumblebee doing this or doing that. It wasn't anything that specific. They weren't micromanaging the stories themselves. Very rarely did they have any comments on, all the plots that I wrote would have to go through Hasbro for approval before they could be given to the artist to draw. But I don't remember them really having any issue with any of my plots. Like saying, don't show this thing. The one thing I remember, there was a cover that Jim Lee drew of an Amazon warrior holding a sword to I forget who it was, but some transformer. And she's holding his head, and his head is connected to the torso of his body, and she has a sword to his throat. And I drew that cover. I drew the layout for that cover. It came to Jim Lee to do the final product, and that got rejected from Hasbro because originally his head was completely decapitated. And it was just his head and some wires hanging down from the neck, and that was too extreme for Hasbro for that audience. So he added the torso, so the head was somewhat detached, but not completely. Other than that, they had very few comments about specific story elements.
I've heard that story, Bob, and I think that's hilarious, given, like I say, they've got headmasters who are routinely lifting their heads off at the drop of a hat, so...
Okay, we've got time for maybe one more question, if we've got one.
Hi. Do you guys think you'll ever collaborate together again, possibly on something outside of Transformers?
We work together again? Well, we never really worked together much in the first place, did we? But if some project came up and somebody said to me, co-write this with Bob, I'd be delighted to. So whether it's Transformers or something else.
Okay, lovely. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Simon Furman.